Thank you, guys. IT. By the way, I'm going to enter the contacts for the IT department or the IT support today. In case you guys run into any trouble, please contact the following folks. I put in the chat box. Let me just take a quick roll call. I'll start with the IOUs. Is PG&E here?
This is Ken. PG&E is present on the line.
Great, thank you. Southern California Edison.
Good afternoon. This is Chris Vias with Southern California Edison, and Edison is on the line.
Thank you. The Sempra companies.
Hey, Ronald. This is Josh Stewart from Sempra
Hey,
Company.
Josh.
We're online.
Thank you. Is Cal Public Advocates on the line today?
Good afternoon. This is Anna Yang.
Hi, Anna. Okay. You can? Okay. I'll come back to you, Ken. Turn.
Yeah, Katie's here, and Chuck Feinstein, Dr. Chuck Feinstein is also on the line.
Thank you. MGRA. I'll return to them, and then Protect Our Communities Foundation. All right, so let me just say, you can, I don't know if you've joined in a few seconds since I've called you, or MGRA. Okay. So is there anyone else that I haven't called that wants to state their presence? All right. So I guess we'll move on from there. All right, so thank you for your attendance today. As usual, we're going to record the session and make it available on the CPUC webpage, or YouTube page, actually, within 2 to 3 days following this meeting today. Everyone, again, has the ability to mute and unmute themselves, but please use the hand raise function if you have a question or comment, and we'll call on you in the order that we see it as best we can. Today's meeting, the purpose and expected outcomes. It's more or less just a forum for the IOUs, the PG&E and SCE specifically, to offer up any concerns and lead any discussions regarding the staff proposal recommendations. And the concerns could be of the recommendations themselves or the implementation of those recommendations. They pretty much have an open floor for a presentation or a discussion. With that said, SPD will also will take the time today, and here's your opportunity to ask us questions directly regarding our recommendations, and we're more than happy to clarify any of the recommendations we've made in our staff proposal, assuming you've read it. And so the agenda as follows. There's not a lot of detail here, but this is ultimately what you should expect to see until 5 o'clock. Like I said, we'll take questions. SPD staff will take questions on the staff proposal, and then PG&E will present and lead a discussion thereafter, and then SCE will then have their presentation with Dr. Mosla, and then and that'll take us to the end of today's meeting. I just want to remind anyone who's not speaking to mute themselves, please. And then, so at this point, we should just get into the questions. But before we do so, I'd like to turn it over to Ben Turner with SPD and allow him to make some opening remarks.
Hey, thanks, Arnold. I'll just be real brief. I thought it'd be useful to just state SPD's intention and address some of the concerns we've heard about the staff proposal at the outset, and then turn it over to questions after that. So the main goal and driver behind our push to move to a benefit cost approach is because we think it's simpler. It'll be ultimately be more transparent, and then it'll ultimately be more useful to energy division staff and decision makers when they're evaluating these proposals in the GRC after the ramp has been filed and completed. So that's the main thing. We just think this is easier. It's more like traditional risk-based decision-making used in other applications outside the commission, and it's more straightforward and understandable. the main concern, we've heard a number of different concerns about the proposal. The first is related to risk attitude and risk tolerance, and those issues not being addressed in the staff proposal when we converted over to from risk scores to like a monetization of the evaluation of consequences. And we just wanted to point out, and we've said this in multiple meetings, but just again that risk attitude and risk tolerance remain the same as they are currently in the settlement agreement. Utilities will have the flexibility to address risk attitude and risk tolerance in their proposals and treat those concepts the way they want to in the risk-based decision-making framework. And then the second thing that I've heard a concern about is that we heard folks say they wanted clarification that the cost benefit or the benefit cost ratio isn't going to be like the be all end all of like why you would select one mitigation over another. And I just wanted to point out that this is also going to be similar to how it's handled right now with RSCs in the SMAP settlement agreement. In the SMAP settlement agreement in line 26, it talks about mitigation selection being influenced by factors other than the risk spend efficiency value, and it cites a number of other factors that could be included. We'd be open to including other factors in that line of the settlement agreement if it was people wanted to reference uncertainty, or if they wanted to reference the exclusion or the failure to capture the entirety of the value of a consequence in the monetization process, or whatever other factor they wanted to mention as a reason for selecting one mitigation over another, even if it might have a less favorable benefit cost ratio. And then finally, we wanted to just point out that the final concern that I've heard a lot about is us changing the rules like midstream. So SEE currently has their ramp before us. They'll be filing their GRC next year, and PG&E will be PG&E has their GRC pending. We don't intend for this change in rules to be applied to efforts that are currently underway and make you redo risk-based decision-making work under a new regulatory regime. So those are the main things I wanted to cover. We're happy to provide further clarification on any of those things. And with that, I just open it up to questions and turn it back over to you, Arnold.
Thanks, Ben. Does anyone want to start with the questions regarding the staff proposal? If there are no questions, or if people haven't had a chance to read the ruling yet, that's perfectly fine. I think we can certainly move forward with the rest of the today's agenda. But I'll allow another few minutes before we do that, if anything comes to mind. Okay, Charles Feinstein has a question.
Let me unmute myself. I presume you can hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. In the proposed change by the staff, it's specifically noted that the staff will permit using the monetized values a nonlinear scaling function. And I suggest that that's inappropriate. In particular, you've gotten one thing quite right, and that is that when you monetize, it's pretty clear that when you're talking about the consequences, a buck is a buck. And that's a linear scaling function for money, which makes perfect sense to me. What I find odd is that the staff thinks it's appropriate to have a nonlinear scale for something like fatalities. And I think the staff maybe has lost sight of something. And this is related to risk attitude, and it's related to what the purpose of the benefit cost ratio is. Let me point out that to have a nonlinear scale with money on the y-axis and fatalities on the x-axis might make sense if you wanted to capture something like risk attitude for fatalities. It doesn't make much sense when you want to capture the amount of risk reduction using that same function. And here, in my opinion, is where this whole thing falls apart with respect to nonlinear scaling. Let me give you a very simple example. I don't need a graph or anything else to prove it or to illustrate it. PG&E, for example, used a nonlinear scaling function. That scaling function went from 0 to 100 fatalities and 0 to 50 weighted units. So instead of 0 to 50 weighted units, you could consider it some arbitrary amount of money, something close to maybe $10 billion, which would be consistent with PG&E's weights and scales. But I ask you to focus on one thing. When you consider the weighted units, that's equivalent to a reduction of one fatality from one fatality to 0, that is equal in PG&E's world to 5/100ths of a weighted unit. When you consider the reduction of one fatality from 100 to 99 fatalities, that's measured as approximately 0.5, in fact, a little greater than 0.5 weighted units. In fact, the number is 0.528. That means that using that scale, one would conclude that reducing or mitigating the consequences by one, or the expected number of one death, is 10 times more valuable for the event that went from 100 fatalities to 99 than it would be for the event that goes from 1 to 0. The problem with that, although that might capture risk reasonably well, you might say, well, such an event is 100 times more risky than such a large event is 100 times more risky than an event which has only one expected death. It makes no sense for risk reduction, and I'll tell you why. If you consider that the event that results in 100 fatalities occurs once a year, and you mitigate it with something that reduces the number of fatalities from 100 to 99, that gives you 1 times 0.5, or a little bit more than a half of a weighted unit per year in risk reduction, which is the numerator of the benefit cost ratio. Now look at the other event. Suppose that happens 10 times a year. You reduce the deaths from 1 to 0, and that gives you a little less, or exactly 0.5 weighted units per year. That means that you would prefer to put in the mitigation that reduces the expected number of deaths from 100 to 99 than the expected number of deaths from 1 to 0. That sounds okay, except for one slight problem. The number of times per year that the very, very consequential 100 deaths event occurs is 1. That means if you did that mitigation, you'd save 1 life. If you did the other mitigation, you would save 10 lives, because that's expected to occur 10 times a year. You cannot have, in my humble opinion, a preference for a mitigation that saves 1 life compared to a mitigation that saves 10 lives. And yet, that's what the nonlinear scaling function requires or implies. The solution to this is rather obvious. You make the scaling function linear. That has the added benefit that the statistical value of life is constant over the entire range of fatalities. And notice that if the scaling function is nonlinear, the statistical value of life varies over the entire range. And I don't think that's what staff intended. And yet that's a direct consequence. Both of those things are direct consequences. So it's my position, and I believe that Turin agrees, that we believe that the scaling function for fatalities, just like the scaling function for money, should be linear.
William, did you want to respond to that, or Max?
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond to that. I mean, I think Dr. Feinstein makes some very interesting points here. In particular, he's pointing out that when you have a nonlinear scaling function, there is sort of a reference effect. In other words, when you're looking at a reduction in risk, it depends on what your reference point is. If you're reducing, from 1 to 0 fatalities, it ends up with a very different value than from reducing from 100 to 99 fatalities. That incremental fatality has a different value using a nonlinear scaling function of the kind that PG&E uses. And that's true with the existing multi-attribute value framework. Because if you can, as we've seen, you can back out the implied value of a statistical life, or if you prefer, value of mortality reduction from the existing functions and the existing multi-attribute value frameworks used by each of the IOUs, as in fact we've done in our original evaluation paper. And what you see is the implied VSL does vary according, and you need to pick your reference point with care. The reference point, in other words, are you considering that your reference point is 0 risk? Well, that's probably not realistic. We already know that there's very considerable risks, and we need to look at the evaluate mitigations relative to our current reference point, which is really significant risk. Now, all these things are true, and I don't know whether, Feinstein, whether you've had a chance to look at the white paper that I think we wrote that was distributed along with this recent, giving examples of how the cost-benefit framework would be applied. But the final section of that paper talks precisely about this, the importance of choosing the right reference point. Now, the thing is that choosing a good reference point is actually quite tricky, but it's equally true with the current framework, the multi-attribute value framework, as it would be with the proposed framework here. So I don't think that shifting from the multi-attribute framework to a cost-benefit framework really affects it. I mean, it's an important point you raise, and that choosing a reference point is a tricky question in each case, but it's really the exact same issue with either framework. And as you point out, you can sidestep all these issues by going to a linear function, which of course is in fact what all of the IOUs except for PG&E have done. They've all now using linear functions, and so this is not really an issue for them. It's only an issue for PG&E, assuming that they continue to use these nonlinear functions. But we wanted to make clear that the cost-benefit framework that we've proposed can allow these nonlinear scaling functions, if indeed, as is the case, that the organization wants to treat, let's say, a risk reduction from 100 fatalities to 99 is 10 times more important than a reduction from 1 fatality to 0. It's eminently reasonable to do that, and they can continue to do that with the proposed new framework. So I don't really see the problem that you're identifying as anything that is going to be in the way of adopting the new framework. Again, agreed that it's tricky to choose the right reference point, but that's true without the framework.
May I reply? It seems that was addressed to me.
Sure.
The point is not whether to go to a cost-benefit framework or stay with the multi-attribute value function framework. The mistake is the mistake in both frameworks. As far as choosing a reference point, as far as I'm concerned, that's a red herring. I would never attempt to do such a thing. The difficulty you have here is that all the software knows, all the computations know, is that there's a scaling function. All the computations can do is compute the risk reduction. All the computations can do is compute a benefit cost ratio. And the benefit cost ratio in the multi-attribute value function formulation and in this formulation are identical. However, you cannot get around the fact that if you use a nonlinear scaling function to measure risk reduction, you will make decisions that seem to make no sense. You can tell me as much as you like that a company prefers to reduce deaths from 100 to 99 compared to reducing deaths from 1 to 0, which, by the way, in my experience with every electric utility I've ever worked for, is completely the opposite. That they will go out of their way to be sure not to allow that first death to happen under any circumstances. So that whole thing becomes completely backwards, in my experience. But that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that if you adopt that kind of a nonlinear scaling function, then you get to what I believe, and I think other people might agree, are absurd conclusions with respect to preferences for risk reduction. That's what makes no sense.
Okay. So maybe I could ask you to clarify this a little bit. So it sounds like you're saying that using these nonlinear scaling functions in this way is dangerous and misleading, and that's equally true of the current scheme as it is of the proposed cost-benefit framework. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, because one of Turn's long-running arguments with PG&E was, and this was in the testimony yesterday, in fact, one of the long-running arguments with PG&E is that they're using this nonlinear scaling function, which distorts things.
Okay, so what you're saying is not really a reason, you're not arguing against the cost-benefit framework. You're arguing against using nonlinear scaling function, whether with the existing framework or with a new framework. Is that correct?
That's correct. And in fact, I must say, as far as I'm concerned, the difference between the cost-benefit framework and the multi-attribute framework is that what's happened is that the cost-benefit framework replaces weighted units with dollars and recognizes that the scale for money is linear. As far as I'm concerned, that's a step in the right direction. My sole objection, which I stated in the last meeting, was that this becomes a very, very difficult thing to do, to write these things down in terms of dollars. And one of the reasons why the multi-attribute value function approach was invented was because it was too difficult to take a multi-attribute decision and write down immediately the objective in terms of dollars.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
staff wants to do that and staff proposes it and believes it can be done, I have no objection. As far as I'm concerned, if you can do the whole thing in dollars, then that simplifies everything.
Right. But would you agree that you can find the implied value in dollars from the multi-attribute framework? So in other words, even if you use a multi-attribute framework, you are implicitly putting dollar values on lives, statistical lives, let's say, and customer minutes interrupted and so on.
Of course. And in fact,
Okay.
that was our argument, that was Turn's argument against the PG&E and the other IOUs whose MAVFs we saw, that their implied statistical value of life was an order of magnitude too large.
Right. So the point about, if one goes to a cost benefit framework, it just makes these things more explicit, things that were already existed in the existing framework, but were just implicit, not so clear.
Well, you could say that. As far as I'm concerned, it's equally transparent, but I'm not the
Okay.
only one involved in deciding what's transparent and what's not.
Okay, very good.
Oh, William, did you want to?
So yes, I just want to emphasize that at least for level 4, and I believe, I don't want to speak for the CPUC, but certainly for level 4, we are not, as part of this, our recommendations, saying that we are necessarily in favor of the nonlinear functions and so on. What we're saying is that as part of the phase 2, we don't need to make that decision. We think that going through all of the discussions about linear functions, nonlinear functions, understanding all the ramifications, all the difficulty, is a quite complicated subject with lots of input that's going to be needed, and that it's appropriate to have those discussions, but it's appropriate to have those discussions as part of the phase 3 proceedings where we have more time. And we believe that in the meantime, we can move forward with initiating the transition to the cost benefit approach and in effect defer the discussions about linear versus nonlinearity to the phase 3.
May I comment on that, please?
Yes, please go ahead.
I disagree fundamentally, because if you're going to go to a cost benefit approach, then you better say up front how it is that you're going to monetize attributes. There's absolutely no point in going through this entire process without stating the rules. How are you going to monetize safety? How are you going to monetize reliability? What are the implications of the monetization? And that's got to be settled a priori. You'll forgive me, but I have heard too often, well, we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about that later. And things get set in concrete. And then when you want to talk about it later and resolve it, you have to break the concrete apart. Seems to me that it's pretty reasonable to get into this discussion right away, because if you don't want to, then you don't appreciate the fundamental importance of this. And I think this is fundamentally important. If you tell me that you're going to monetize safety, then you better tell me how.
This is Ben again. So right now, I mean, you just estimate it in risk points, and we would just be using dollars, which everyone already understands. So I don't see how this makes it more concrete or less concrete, given that they use risk scores, which there's no rigid rules on how they assign risk scores to consequences, and we're just putting it into units that are fundamentally more understandable and readily accessible to folks who have to evaluate these proposals.
I understand your point, but let me respond to that. In the multi-attribute value framework, there is one correct way and only one correct way to write down the statistical value of life that's implied by the weights and the scales. And so we did that. And that means that the agreement or the implicit agreement, when you use a multi-attribute value function, is that there's evaluation of the weighted units with respect to dollars. There's evaluation of the weighted units with respect to, say, fatalities. And then there's a trivial conversion that evaluates the dollars and the fatalities. And there's only one right way to do that. Now, granted, that's not part of the settlement, but that's part of the mathematics of the thing. And so what I don't see is the statement that says, well, you know, it's fuzzy, it's risk units, it's not as concrete as this might be. It is the same concreteness. All the implications of the multi-attribute value function are expressible in terms of dollars. And so I don't understand how you can say that it doesn't make sense to talk about how you're going to monetize the thing in this framework, which was monetized in the multi-attribute value framework. And let me underline this. It was monetized in the multi-attribute value framework by specifying the weights and the ranges of the attributes. Once you've got that done, then you know the statistical value of life. You know the dollar value of a weighted unit. I need to know the same thing for this, and it's missing. It's just not here. And then it gets made even more fuzzy by saying, well, what I'm going to do is write a nonlinear function of fatalities where dollars are on the y-axis. How? How did you do that? You can't just do it willy-nilly. You have to say that that's related to something. What is it related to? The statistical value of life. Good. How is it related? That's what I want to know. And I tell you, there's only one right way to do that.
What is that right way?
If you don't make a linear scale for fatalities, where the slope is the statistical value of life,
Right.
you're going to get into contradictions you don't want to admit when you evaluate mitigations. I'm not arguing with you about whether or not you want to use an attitude towards risk. That's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to talk about how you evaluate mitigations when lives are at stake.
Right. But I mean, well, as we already discussed, I mean, the same issue applies to either framework. And so switching to a cost-benefit framework doesn't make this issue any worse or any better. It may make it a little more explicit, arguably. You know, it's certainly something that could be discussed at a later point. It's really the treatment of these nonlinear functions and risk attitudes is independent of the question of which framework we use.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with that, but I understand the point you're making.
Yeah.
I don't think it's independent at all. I think they're bound up very tightly. You yourself said, as I recall, that the proper way to include risk attitude is to do various computations with the multi-attribute value function and then use a risk attitude function to express that answer in terms of utility. At least I remember you were saying that.
Well, I think what I said, and it is in that white paper, that it's the more standard practice among decision analysts is to treat risk attitude after you've combined the attributes. But certainly, you know, this is not the only multi-attribute function where there's risk attitude at the attribute level. So it's not an illegitimate thing to do by any means.
No.
What I was saying is, you know, in the literature that I've seen in the example applications I've been involved with, it's more normal to do it at the end, but not that it's wrong to do it in the way that it's currently being done by any means.
But the subtlety in the computation here is that we're computing benefit cost ratios, and the numerator of the benefit cost ratio is risk reduction. That's different than the typical decision analysis problem, in my opinion. And the fact that we're looking for a method for computing, the fact that we're looking for a method to compute risk reduction puts constraints on how we can measure the values of attributes.
I mean, in my experience, most decision analyses, multi-attribute decision analysis, you're looking at relative effects, reductions in cost or increases in cost or risk. So I'm not sure I see that as a major distinction here. You look at, there's always a question about, what's the current situation, what's the reference point, and how do we evaluate, improvements or worsening relative to where we are right now. So it seems to me this fits in, the framework fits in pretty well with other applications that I've seen.
Let's have Sam and then Matthew.
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, I want to back up Professor Feinstein on the problem with nonlinearities. His example of the thing with the fatalities is almost exactly like the example I used that leads to absurd results. But let's stay away from risk attitude. Let's just look at economic impact. There are undeniable nonlinearities there. A 1 hour outage does not spoil your food. A 4 hour outage spoils your food. It's very nonlinear. And the issue here is to even do computations just of the economic damage, let alone any risk attitude. To do computations with nonlinear penalties cannot be done with averages. That leads to what I call the flaw of averages, or Jensen called Jensen's inequality. So the issue is doing the arithmetic of uncertainty correctly, and we somehow need to do that to get anything right. So they're really, if you think about penalties for something going wrong, one penalty is an economic penalty, another penalty is a preference penalty. And I can imagine preferences for different stakeholders being different. That is, if I have two regions, one of which has had 50 power outages this year, and the other has not had any power outages, I would see that the people who already had 50 are going to be more sensitive to power outages and would have a different risk attitude about that. At this stage, I do believe that given that we're not even doing the arithmetic right, we shouldn't be worried so much about the final accounting rules. So I think it's really much more fundamental. I think the problems are much more fundamental than Professor Feinstein brought up. We've got to do the math right, and then decide what we're going to do with risk attitudes later. But if we're just doing all our calculations with averages of any sort, we're on very shaky ground. And that's what I think it should be. I think we should, I love the idea of monetization. There seem to be two extra parameters in the MAVF, an upper bound and lower bound, which I don't know how you'd calculate. Working towards monetization just makes the whole thing so much simpler. And then whether functions are linear or nonlinear, the nonlinear ones are harder to deal with. Yeah, you'd have to justify why saving one life was worth 10 times more than saving another life. I'm not going to defend that. But I can see situations where you've already had 50 power outages. And if I have one more power outage this year, my stakeholders, my customers are going to burn my office down. And then I have to view that preference differently. But I don't really feel we're ready for that until we start aggregating things correctly. Where it fails is if you start aggregating risks that have nonlinear economic or preference consequences, either one.
Matthew, did you want to say something? Does anyone else have any comments or questions?
One last comment, please. Very short. I have no
Yes, please go
objection.
ahead.
I have no objection to nonlinear scaling functions for virtually all attributes. However, it seems to me that fatalities in particular and money are special. and different.
All right, thank you for your comment. Okay, if there are no other questions or comments for now, and I think we can, if time allows, we can always come back to this if something else comes up. But why don't we take a short break till until 1:50, and then we'll be back at 1:50, and PG&E, Ken Arnold, and Vincent and his team will present on their section. Thank you, guys. Hello, everybody. It's 1:50. We'll give it another minute for folks to get back. And then I don't know if Ken, you're already on here or not.
I am, yes. If you can hear me, I will be driving and Vincent will be presenting for us today. And I'll go ahead and
Yeah. Can you let folks know if you guys would prefer to make the full presentation before taking questions, or if people can ask questions in between? I'll leave that up to you.
I would like to say hold questions to end, but I think it makes more sense to pause and field questions as they come along. It just happens naturally anyway. So I think we'll go that route.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Great. So Arnold, you say, I think you say when, and Vincent will start us off.
Yeah, let me just quickly take a roll call, make sure everybody's back. So I'll go through this quickly. Obviously, PG&E's here. Southern California Edison, are you guys here?
Yes, Southern California Edison is here.
Sempra Companies,
We're here, Arnold.
thank you. Cal Public Advocates,
Yes, we're here.
thank you. UCAN, oh yeah, I don't think Eric's on. Turn,
Was that turn? Because Katie's
Yes.
here.
thank you. MGRA, I don't think it's here.
MGRA is
Oh.
here. Multitasking, sorry.
And Protect Our Communities Foundation.
Yes, I'm here. Melinda's here. Thanks.
I'm all done. Okay. All right, Ken, take it away.
I think Vincent is back. If not, can move forward.
You can. Okay, I guess I'm taking over from here. Okay, so thank you, Arnold. So basically, we wanted to bring out some thoughts on the proposal that the staff made. And you can see this slide is titled Incorporating Risk Tolerance in the RDF. This is our current working position. Obviously things can change. There's some things that we want to speak about, and also some more preliminary thoughts on going forward as well. So that's basically what this presentation will look like. So a couple of thoughts on the staff proposal. So after having read the staff proposal, we feel that the staff proposal is a critical first step that PG&E believes is beneficial to the progression of the risk-based decision-making framework. Because for the following reasons, right? It promotes transparency about assumptions and modeling choices, promotes consistency, broadens the discussion of risk by expressing it in familiar units. I think these points all have merits. We also wanted to note that, as SPD mentioned in the proposal, there's further discussion that's going to be required in phase 3, and potentially modifications, more modifications to the SMAP framework as we go down to phase 3. Any questions so far? Okay, let's move to the next slide. So staff proposal addresses a few things. It addresses, for example, treatment of ESG impacts, provides guidance on the VSL, what to use for value of lost load and gas reliability, provides guidance on all those topics. But it also, as we're talking about here, takes steps towards a cost-benefit framework, right? So cost-benefit framework, basically idea, you express the numerator in dollars, you express the denominator in dollars, and there's your cost-benefit framework, right? So greater than 1, less than 1. And so here, we want to bring out, like, is that it? Is that risk management? I think the answer from our standpoint is flatly no. Because among other things, we need to consider how risk tolerance, and we'll get to this topic, in the next few slides how risk tolerance will be incorporated, right? Risk tolerance, broadly speaking, determines whether the residual risk is within acceptable levels. And it's an established principle. So there is this court ruling, Industrial Union versus American Petroleum Institute, 1980 Supreme Court ruling, where the court established that rulemaking by a regulator must comply with its authority and demonstrate by scientific evidence a safety concern that is risk significant, as by crossing a set threshold called a threshold requirement, and any risk management measures set in regulation to address this safety concern, if it exceeds the threshold, are not necessarily governed by benefit cost analysis. However, subsequent improvements of such measures can be governed by benefit cost analysis. So basically, it's saying that you should have a threshold, and if your risk is above the threshold, you should do what it takes to do to get to that threshold. And then, once you get to that threshold, is where the regime, the realm of cost benefit analysis can be used. So I think we've talked a lot about setting up the risk framework so far, but we've hardly talked that much about risk tolerance. So we feel that as we go forward, this is the next topic we have to address. Can you move the slide forward? So as far as risk tolerance is concerned, the way we specify it, I mentioned it's basically, seeing whether your risk is at some acceptable level or not. And, how do you think about it? I think there are various ways we can talk about it. Since we're moving to a dollar framework, I should say, can be specified both at the overall dollar-based level, but more likely, we feel it's probably going to be some tolerances we set at the natural unit level, number of fatalities, number of occurrences of events, and also kind of by risk as well, right? So we might have different risk tolerances for different risks. And basically, the point that we're trying to make here is that the RDF, the risk decision framework, needs to be flexible enough to recognize and incorporate these different specifications and objectives. I kind of personally see it as there's a distribution in natural units for the events that you're thinking about, for the risk events that you're thinking about, right? Be it in dollars, be it in equivalent fatalities. There's a distribution, and basically risk tolerance is basically saying, I want this distribution to look like a certain way. Basically, it's a statement of what your exceedance curve looks like, or if you want to think about distribution, same thing. It's basically a statement of what that curve should look like. That's how I think about it. And I think that's why it's natural to think about it in the, no pun intended, but it makes sense to think about it in the natural unit sense, right? Because you want to look at fatalities and look at what that distribution looks like. And you want to actively manage that distribution. And so that's why I think for the risk framework to be it should be flexible enough to incorporate that, because that's how people naturally think about it. I think it's an effective way of managing the risk as well. The other topic I wanted to bring up was there's also this risk attitude, also known as a utility function in decision analysis. And basically, kind of the way I think of it, it's the price to mitigate the risk, right? It's the price to eliminate the risk. And it's the price, since we're talking dollars here, moving to a dollar framework, it's a price where you would be indifferent towards, accepting or paying a certain dollar amount versus taking on that risk. So I kind of think about that as basically the price of the risk. So you can see the two concepts are pretty closely related. Okay, let's move to the next slide. As far as risk tolerance is concerned, it's not something new that we're talking about. We're just basically bringing up a point that was made in the 2016 decision, right? And if you look at the 2016 decision, it said Commission should adopt explicit risk tolerance standards over time, not before laying the groundwork in the development of probabilistic risk analysis. So that's where we stand. PG&E believes we are at an appropriate stage where the groundwork has been laid to start adopting risk tolerance standards. Expressing risk in dollars is a worthwhile goal. Yeah, because it's going to provide this level of transparency, right? It's going to provide this, no pun intended again, it's going to provide this common currency for us to talk about risk. I think that's worthwhile. But at the same time, right, we have all this transparency on one side of the risk picture, but we need the transparency on what are we managing, what are the risk tolerance are we dealing with here. I feel that's why this is the right time we need to bring it up.
It looks like Sam has a question.
Oh yeah, Sam. Yep.
Yeah. So Vincent, sorry, let me stop swinging here. Hold on a minute. Okay. So Vincent, let me see if I can repeat back. Risk tolerance to me, as you're describing it, sounds more like a threshold. Like you can't, this is intolerable for society, right? And the risk attitude is really this utility function. But wouldn't the risk tolerance then, I mean, it seems reasonable to me, but that isn't changing the shape of the distribution. That's saying the distribution can't go beyond this point, right? It's really a constraint, I would say. Would you look at it that way?
Yeah, it's like, it's like the distribution can't go beyond this point. I mean, that's one way of thinking of it. And the other way that you mentioned it, I think in previous TWGs, was that you mentioned you could have a utility function at some point in time, it just goes up, become a vertical line.
Exactly.
And you'll see we thought about, and once again, these are all just thoughts, right? And the point I want to make, the overall point I want to make is that we have complicated topics coming up, and we need to start like getting these thoughts, start thinking about them really, because there are different ways to implement that. It's like if you have a utility function that goes up to a vertical line, then basically, you're saying that if you have a distribution that has some weight beyond the vertical line, you're going to get an infinity if you do some integral, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, that's nice, that's really nice, but all the real world distributions we have out there, have weight, like infinity. So it's like, if you do that, you're just going to get a lot of infinities in your
So I just want to point,
RCs.
I want to point out a couple of things. I mean, I wouldn't argue against this. I would say it captures, by the way, something that ALARP talks about, but and this is a guaranteed nonlinear utility function. I mean, you can't get more nonlinear than we go up at a slope, which is the cost of whatever, and then we cannot cross this threshold.
Yep.
And so it's above my pay grade to say whether, I'm not going to opine on this because I'm not the decision analyst.
Yeah, we were thinking about it. I guess we can, if there are no questions on this slide, because I think we do get to this slide. I think it's the slide, the next slide. So Ken, let's move to the next slide. Yeah. So exactly what we were talking about, Sam. So, we have some thoughts, once again, some thoughts on how this can be implemented, right? So and this is basically, you can see the graph. I drew the graph, I drew the picture too. I think that's what we were just talking about. You have this utility function, I should say risk attitude function, that at some point in time it just goes up to a straight line. And so no, we did think about it. We were just concerned that doing that, it's like you're making really strong statements about the distributions out there, and it could be the fact right now that if we do it, we're just going to get a bunch of infinities, a lot of infinities in our number, and I think nobody wants to see that. So I toyed around with the idea, oh, maybe we make it not like a straight line, I mean, kind of straight line, it's like, but let them anyway. So
whatever you're nonlinear. If you look at the bottom of your graph, a little curve in there, which is nonlinear, you see curve. No, even if that were a straight line at the bottom of your thing, right, just go up straight, when you get to the kink in the curve, I think what you're telling us, Vincent, is that the world is nonlinear, and we're probably not going to be able to get away from that
I
reality.
can believe that, yeah. And then yeah, so basically, it's like I think I kind of like that. Well, personally speaking, again, I kind of like that nonlinear vertical line. It's like if you get an infinity, it's actually telling me something. It's like basically it is telling me something, but I do think it's a bit difficult to implement. I think that's why we kind of, and once again, these are early thoughts, right? So I do think that one of the alternatives we're thinking about, and once again, this is basically to let everybody know that we have heady topics that we need to address. So one of the thoughts that we have out there is, instead of having a vertical line in our risk attitude function, we have set limits on the distribution, right? Basically we look at the native distribution, look at the exceedance curve, and make some statement about what we want that exceedance curve to look like. Recognizing that, it's like having an exceedance curve that just drops off the edge is probably going to be very hard to achieve. And I think it's also easier to think about because this is a concept that we can pass on to our lines of business, to the operating groups that are actually working on this problem, and they can think about it in those terms. I think it's just easier for us to express that in the natural units, right? Be it reliability units, CMI, be it dollars, whatnot, right? So we think that we should have the flexibility to think about and think about how we want the exceedance curves to be shaped for those reasons. And then risk tolerant. So we would have basically a statement saying, we can go to the next slide. I think that kind of I think you've all seen this slide. It looks very familiar. So the risk curve the red curve would show that what our exceedance curve looks like before, what it looks like currently. Let's say it's a risk. And that green curve shows it where we want to be. So what we're saying is basically it's like if we have portions of the red curve that's to the right of the green curve, as in this example, we need to get below, we need to get to the left of that green curve first. Once we get to the left of the green curve, we can start looking at, things like benefit cost ratios to determine whether additional measures are justified. So I think what I'm saying is nothing new, right? I mean, look at the 2016 decisions. It's like we had this discussion back then. The thing was basically, I think it was your 50-foot building argument, Sam, right? It was a 50-foot building argument. Basically, we need to do all this other work first before we can tackle this. And I think, we are doing the work. We're at this stage. And once again, I think it's important because we're putting everything in dollars. So it's like now we have the dollars on this one end, it's very transparent what dollar is. So now we need to shine a light on all these other things that make up risk management. I think it's an appropriate time to talk about it. Any thoughts? Any questions so far?
Well, if I might say something here, Vincent.
Please.
Clearly humans like, it's a lot easier to think about absolute limits. Like it's, to say, well, it's just absolutely unacceptable to have any activity that will have more than X number of fatalities, let's say. And, if we specify a risk tolerance in that way, it's easy for people to understand and maybe possible for someone to make the judgment about what X should be. But the question, but of course, as a practical matter, in this business, it's hard to guarantee that any particular activity or mitigation, activity will have some very defined maximum upper limit. So I don't know. I mean, do you think that's, I mean, so having that kind of definite upper limit is, nice, but not clear how practical it would be.
Yeah, and we're not saying that
Okay.
we're not saying that with this picture as well, right? Because
Right.
you can see
But
even with the green line here, with the green curve here, it doesn't fall off a cliff and go to zero at some point in time.
yeah,
So we're just saying that, this distribution, the red distribution, the red exceedance curve is not acceptable. We
Yeah.
need to get to the green acceptable curve.
I just want to suggest one thing here, and I know, Joe, you've got your hand up, but just want to suggest one thing. Instead of saying, thou shalt not ever let this happen, you can say, we will let it happen once in 10 million years. See, so the important thing is, I cannot estimate the chance that an asteroid is going to strike me on my hammock here before this talk is over, before this conference is over. But I am willing to bet that it's low enough that I'm not going to go dig a hole somewhere and try to bury myself. So we deal with extremely rare events all the time. And I think putting a probabilistic limit in it might say, yes, 1 in a million years, somehow we don't have to worry about this then, right? If you see what I mean, instead of just saying it's right, you don't get quite the infinite line that way, right?
Yeah, totally agree. I think when we talk about risk tolerance, it's basically a statement of it's a probabilistic statement, not an absolute statement.
Right.
Katie had her hand up, and then Joseph Mitchell.
Yeah, I'm looking at this and I'm just wondering how considerations of, I'm going to call it budget, but I think you could also call it customer affordability, ratepayer affordability, kind of would also be incorporated into this as you're identifying what to spend. I think we all know that ratepayers, especially right now as we potentially enter an economic downturn, it's unclear, can't incorporate a lot more spending. So I guess I'm just trying to ask, how are you including those limits when you're considering, your portfolio?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of ways to think about it. Basically, if you're above the pre-mitigation, I'm sorry, if you're above the green line, right? I mean, once again, these are thoughts. If you're above the green line, right? We're not saying basically that you shouldn't look at money at all. But I think when you're above the green line, you're above on that red line, basically you're at a stage where, you need to consider, you need to get to that green portion, and the way the cost of factor in is that you need to compare all the different mitigations out there that you have that will get you to that green line, and look at, take cost into as part of one of the factors when you look at those alternatives that you have out there to get you below that green line. So it's not like we're saying, cost is totally out of it. It's like, I'm sure you'll have alternatives in how you can get below that green line, and cost should be one of the considerations, one of the things that you look at when you consider those alternatives.
Joseph Mitchell, Mustard Grade. My concern was very similar to what Katie just raised. It seems to me that, once you've got some sort of flag that says, regardless of anything, this must be, regardless of any cost, this must be reduced to this level, that means that any spend becomes justified. And if that, yeah, so
I mean, the other way you can switch it around, Dr. Mitchell, excuse me, but the other way you can switch it around is like, the other way you can switch it around is basically, it's like, if this cost is going to be a constraint, then we'll have to accept that we're not going to get to the green line. We're going to get to another line, right? So that's the other way to look at the problem. And it's like, we're not saying that's not possible, but we just want to make it clear, everybody's, put the expectation out there. This is what we're going to be doing for those reasons, because we're constrained by cost or otherwise. We're probably not going to hit the green line. We're going to hit this other line, and all we want is transparency, so everybody knows what we're buying into.
Yeah, so one way of looking at it is that you've got actually conflicting risk constraints. So that by taking on, addressing a risk in one way, you're increasing risk in another way. And then that itself becomes a cost benefit. I think we did the example in our GRC testimony, and I think in a couple of other filings, regarding what happens to low-income people as their income drops and how their life expectancy drops. And if this is multiplied over a large number of people, you start by removing money from them, actually doing potentially more harm than good by mitigation actions if those are very expensive mitigation actions. So having a framework that can transparently incorporate all of these constraints and allow us to make some societal judgments as to what's the most appropriate would be, I think, the ideal frame. Thanks.
Sam, please go ahead.
Yeah, so let me second what Joe just said. See, this is why I don't like encoding risks into scores, single numbers. I want to see a trade-off curve. If I'm the CPUC, or if I'm the state of California, I want to see trade-off curves between cost and safety, right? And I'm not going to see that if we weld things in down at the asset level. This is the risk of this asset, and buried in there was some assumption about how much we're going to spend for risk reduction. And this is, I mean, computationally, it's not that easy to do, but I mean, I would love to see a system that gives us trade-off curves at a very high level, so the stakeholders with different outlooks, different stakeholders can look at the trade-off curves and then do good old-fashioned arm wrestling or whatever they have to do to decide where to go in the trade-off curve. Again, it's with enough transparency, then the stakeholders can see things at a very high level.
Yeah. So I believe, Dr. Mitchell, what what you described there. So yeah, I think it's right. I think this framework, we also believe, this framework, well, I believe that this framework that, we're talking about risk tolerances, we'll also show where we're spending the money and whether, and it's a societal, some of it will be a societal decision. And I think this framework will show that, right? It's like, perhaps it's too much money to spend to achieve a certain risk profile, but then we need to, then we can recalculate what the risk profile would be like if you only had a certain amount to spend. And is that acceptable? That's one thing I think that this framework will help people answer that question. I want to move on to the next slide. If we thought the rest was preliminary, this is even more preliminary. This is what we're thinking in terms of given the SPD proposal and how we'll move forward, especially when we think about our 2024 implementation of 2024 ramp, right? So we talked about I'll get to the how we see the SPD proposal changing how we're doing things. We'll talk about that first, and then we'll talk about the tolerances. But basically, you can see here, I have a bow tie, and what I've done in the bow tie is I've dropped some distributions, and I kind of put some arrows to show how the SPD proposal will preliminarily thinking how it will impact our implementation, right? So we start off with, for example, with safety. You can see that's a safety distribution based on data, based on SME, what have you. We'll come up with a safety distribution as we do now. But here, what we're going to do is, based on the SPD proposal, use the established value of mortality risk reduction, the guidance given by SPD, and convert that into a dollar distribution. Likewise with reliability. Reliability a little tougher because I think right now we have a reliability scale reliability scaling function already. The SPD guidance was to use the ICE value. So we're going to have to replace replace our reliability scaling function with the ICE scaling function. It's a different form, but basically, going to convert that. So the reliability distribution is going to look like different because I think I'm not entirely sure, but I believe ICE looks at more than just one dimension than CMI, might look at multiple dimensions, in which case you could have a multiple, multiple dimension distribution. We take and convert that basically once again into a distribution, dollar distribution, right? And then finally with financial, you just have a distribution of financial losses. Don't have to convert that anything because it's already in dollars. And then after you get that frequency distribution in dollars for all these three different attributes, that's where we apply our risk attitude. And then out of that risk attitude, basically you would get the risk attitude converts dollars to dollars again. But what it's doing really, it's determining, it's a risk adjustment, right? It's an adjustment for whether to have a risk premium on top of expected value. So it's basically what comes out of the calculation is going to be in dollars. It's going to be risk adjusted dollars. And I think that's the point we wanted to bring up. It'll be risk adjusted. That includes a premium over the expected dollars. And then that would be compared against, and then you have your cost in the denominator, and that would be basically, if you want to go that way, look at the cost benefit that way. So once again, these are preliminary thoughts. I think there are different ideas on how to do this, but these are our thoughts given where we sit right now in terms of technology and the amount of work that we have in front of us.
Sam has his hand raised.
Yes,
So
yes.
I love this picture, Vincent. I just want to see a distribution coming out on the right.
Yeah.
I mean,
We kind of have
why not?
we kind of
Yeah.
have the distribution, right? I mean, so do we
Yeah.
could just So yeah. Well, I mean, like what we do right now is we already keep the distribution, so we already have that. It's just that to your point, we don't pay attention to it, and I think that's what you
Right.
want us to do.
Right, exactly. We can save it. Yeah.
Okay, I think that was the last slide, so that concludes my presentation. If there are any questions.
See, Vincent, I have a question here, which is just to check I mean, obviously there are some issues about how to treat risk attitude and related concepts as you've described and suggested some very interesting ideas about how to do that. Is it true to say, I mean, you're not suggesting that those have to be resolved before there's a decision about whether to move to a cost benefit framework, or are you?
No, we're not suggesting that. We believe that the framework that is in the phase 2 proposal, as it stands, doesn't, it gives it, I think William mentioned it earlier, right? It doesn't, it doesn't, how do I say this? Doesn't preclude us from doing what we need to do. So.
Right.
Yeah. And sorry, my bad. I never got back to talking about the tolerances. So you can see on the left side here, you can see us. It might kind of take at like where the risk tolerance could be applied, right? Perhaps it could be applied at a driver level. We could say we expect we expect that, you know, that 5% of the time, you know, your tail, your 5% stuff, we don't want to see that to be larger than a certain number. So that's directly on the driver side here in this particular picture. And you could also establish tolerance levels on your consequence side as well. But that's how we see that playing in. And I think, you know, it'd be nice to be clear about exactly what we want, what those tolerances are, so people can, you know, for the full picture when we look at this risk, how we're managing it.
Very good.
Okay, Arnold, I think I'm done.
All right, if there are no more questions, let's take a 10-minute break and then we'll have SCE do their presentation. Thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Oh, so we'll be
Thank
back at 2:36. All right, everybody, it's 2:36. Let me just take a quick roll call before I turn it over to Chris Vias and SCE. I see you on the phone already, on the call already. So is PG&E back from break?
Yes, PG,
Yes, Arnold, we're
PG is
here.
present.
Thank you, guys. Separate companies,
We're here, Arnold.
public advocates.
Yes, we're here.
Thank you. Turn.
Turn is
NDRA.
here. Turn
Thank
is
you.
here. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. NDRA, Joe Mitchell,
Present.
and Protect Our Communities Foundation.
Present.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll turn it over at this point to Chris Vias, and we'll get started with this the SoCal Edison presentation.
Arnold, thank you very much. Much appreciated. Good afternoon, everybody. Before SCE starts its part of the technical working group, we want to just first, again, thank our hardworking staff team for coordinating this technical working group. And we also thank the parties for their participation and the exchange of perspectives amongst participants and their representatives during this sequence of technical working groups. I'm just going to take a minute to introduce our independent expert, Dr. Ali Mosley. In SCE's informal comments regarding an earlier workshop, specifically phase 2 workshop number 2, SCE, supported by the Semper Utilities and PG&E, requested that Dr. Mosley be given an opportunity to present at a technical working group. Our set of written comments also provided information on Dr. Mosley and summarized the concepts and principles that he was expected to present on. Very briefly, Dr. Mosley is the director of the Garrick Institute for Risk Sciences at UCLA. He has a number of professional attainments, including serving on a presidential commission on critical infrastructure protection. He's a very widely respected authority. On risk issues, and he has significant experience advising industry on risk-based decision-making, including utility companies and nuclear power entities. This afternoon, he'll be addressing challenges in both the MAVF framework and the cost-based framework. Dr. Mosley will outline how each of the existing frameworks can be improved and made more useful, and he'll also speak to alternative risk analysis paths, making reference to other relevant industries. We very much appreciate the chance to have Dr. Mosley be heard today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mosley. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris, and the audience. It's a privilege for me to present some ideas in front of such a distinguished panel of experts. Listening to what you have said so far and covered makes me feel that, of course, I'm among very top experts in the domain, and for that I would apologize in advance if some of the comments and remarks I make are essentially things that are well accepted, understood, or have been subject of previous debates, which I'm sure they have. Before I start, let me also say hello to an old friend of mine, Max. We haven't spoken for maybe 30 years or so, but you look as young as you looked then to me.
Well, you're flattering me, but great to see you, Ali.
Yeah, great to be here. And I read your white paper, and I really enjoyed it. It's a very, very solid work, as expected from an expert such as you. And learned quite a bit. And you see, essentially, I'm not going to repeat what you have already outlined there, and I'm going to try to kind of basically focus on the points that I think maybe deserve some additional discussions and considerations. If we have a little bit of time, but I'm going to kind of basically be a bit faster on obvious points, but the whole thing could also be summarized by my kind of last slide, where essentially a couple of key points take away. And if we run out of time, I can very quickly go to the end of the presentation and then share with you those points. Can I drive the slides, or I need to ask someone to? Have I been given the?
Dr. Mose, we were going to have Dan Kamala drive this.
Okay, very good. Okay, very good. Okay, thanks. So good, you're in the right slide. Some of these things are preliminaries, and then again, all of you are familiar, but it's always good to have kind of basically provide a little bit of background and common language so that the key points become quite to communicate. So basically, we're talking about appropriate risk-informed decision-making. Risk-based, risk-informed, this has been debated. I think what we see commonly referred to as the preferred perspective is risk-informed decision, because there are a lot of other considerations in decisions we make that are not necessarily solely based on magnitudes of risk as we calculate. It's risk-informed. And essentially, risk-informed decision-making, or RIDM, involves analyzing potential outcomes, consequences, and associated probabilities, that's risk, and deciding which choices among the options are most prudent. And our common understanding of the notion of risk, it's a combination of two critical elements, namely undesirability and uncertainty of an event or situation, which translate into the likelihood of events and the consequences, adverse consequences of those. So these are kind of the foundational concepts and ideas. If you add this description of the event of the situation to this combination of uncertainty and desirability, you get what is known as the triplet risk triplet, which is quite popular, as most of you know, in a wide range of industries and government sectors, the triplet risk. Now, various metrics have been defined and used to represent risk. We have qualitative metrics, quantitative metrics, and a variety of other forms or shapes, some of which we go back to in the course of this presentation. The way you also package the information and present it, risk representation, there are a number of frameworks or alternatives. The last two, simple equations that I have at the bottom of this slide basically point to the two most kind of widely used methods of calculating risk. One on the left is probability times consequence, or risk average, which we all know there are kind of issues and problems associated with that. Or the alternative, which is basically says, present both the probability and the consequences. That's your measure of risk. Press it into average. Next slide, please. And please stop me at any point that you have a question at some point, a few points in the presentation, and ask for input and feedback from you. At any point, please let me know if you have any question that you need to address immediately. Now, again, continuing on risk-informed decision frameworks, and the decision-making, again, under uncertainty, really involves knowing the risks and then making the right prudent choice. And the second of these two ties to kind of ethical questions of morale and norms. So it's hard to separate an effective risk management framework from issues of the ethical aspects and the social and political context of the decision. And then depending on what ethical perspective, theory you adhere to, approaches that have been discussed for establishing good decisions have given rise to a number of frameworks and perspectives that some of them have been mentioned already in this afternoon. The cost-benefit analysis, minimum safety criteria, ALARP, and the precautionary principle kind of going to the extreme. So, these things are being discussed and debated for decades. Right, next, please. And then input to all this, of course, is the actual conduct of a risk analysis. Again, this is well established, well known by all of you, but I just kind of make sure that I share the vocabulary I use here. That the risk assessment is really the process of determining potential undesirable consequences associated with either natural events or system and processes. As in that assessment, we need to identify scenarios. I call it kind of a scenario-driven risk assessment by which those consequences could occur. And then next is to assess the likelihood and uncertainty associated with those, typically probability of these events. All this is really input to decision for decision makers to make prudent, optimal decision, choices among the alternatives and the strategies to reduce risk. Next. All of this, of course, is done in a context of the socioeconomic environment of the system and the process, the regulatory environment and the physical environment. So, for a comprehensive perspective on risk and risk management and defining basically criteria, acceptance, and attributes and all that, this context need to be considered. Next. And in most vast majority of industries and domains where issues of risk are critical, over the past 40 years or so, people have moved toward rigorous ways of developing metrics and then measures and estimation of risk using models. And, I call them model-based risk assessment. Of course, pretty much all risk assessment in one form or shape or model-based. Here, I want to highlight kind of a particular feature of these model-based assessments that I think it's important, namely a causal model, understanding the relationship between risk factors and the levels of risk. And then this is the type of thing that has been adopted by Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Federal Aviation Administration, FERC, NASA, BESI, more recently, EPA, and in the chemical and process industry, among others. This is a way of basically capturing the context and the issues associated with the risk drivers through some formal model and representation of the scenarios that go from some perturbation in the system operation and design all the way to the consequences associated with those. Next.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mosley. On this slide, you mentioned FERC, and I was just curious, is this in any way used then by NERC or for regulation of the electric grid?
No, this particular one is really what they have been doing in the area of dam safety.
Got it. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, yes. It's just like examples of that. And they have developed fairly comprehensive kind of guidelines, and they're training their staff and their forces to really regulate the hydroelectric, kind of essentially dams and dams operations through a risk informed perspective. Next. And then, of course, when you do the risk assessment, there is a risk representation we talked about. On the upper right, I have, the typical 3x3 or 5x5 qualitative ways of representing risk. And on the left, I have the risk curve and the combination of loss versus likelihood and the acceptance line we just discussed. So kind of there are different forms that people have proposed and used and continue to use risk assessment depending on the organization and where in the organization such concepts come up. For instance, some organizations, for instance, use the risk matrix at the highest level of communication with management or policymakers, and then deeper behind that, they use fairly structured, quantitative, model-based risk assessment. There are different reasons for doing that. and organizational preferences. But pretty much there is kind of a wide range of providing input to decision makers. Next. What are the key challenges? This is my summary based on my experience and what I've seen in different industries, and also more recently being exposed to the challenges that this community has. Is really, first is making risk management decisions or risk-informed decisions with multi-dimensional, multi-attribute risk consequences. That's the main kind of a reason, motivation, I believe, behind multi-attribute utility theory use, the MAVEF framework and all that, to really somehow tackle that and fit it within a common or popular decision analytical framework. But it's a challenge, as we all know and have seen and discussed. Second one is, again, was mentioned earlier, defining acceptable levels of risk tolerance, considering technical feasibility. I said, the root of these things, anytime you draw an acceptable line, there's a moral, political, and a social kind of a context or background that need to be considered. But there's technical feasibility and a rational balance between cost and benefit. I think Katie mentioned is basically the question of affordability. Kind of that's really critical element of defining a rational basis for risk tolerance. When we kind of cover that topic in a bit more detail, come back to some of the things that I heard earlier about, basically the meaning of the lines and then practical kind of considerations of establishing those. The third category of challenge is a common challenge to risk assessment of rare or extremely rare events, mainly low probability, high consequence cases. And it's in that domain that we run into kind of basically technical challenges, difficulty of quantifying risk with little, no data, right? And so many of the high risk industries really have this challenge, and they cope with it in a variety of ways. So given these are kind of challenges, there's more, but I try to kind of pick the ones that are central and also kind of maybe some a bit more relevant to the topics today. Next. So if I look at the current MAVF and the CBF proposed, alternatives, again, MAVF is primarily an attempt to address the first challenge, namely the multi-attribute, multi-dimensional risk. How do we do that? And the strength and shortcoming have been discussed and debated. You have been exposed and have discussed it. We have heard a number of comments, very insightful, detailed, important challenges and issues. So I'm not going to repeat those because they're well established, well known. The main criticism has to do with inevitable value judgment as part of the risk calculation, and the attribute range and weights, okay, and the normalization through kind of a utility function. Other set of issues have emerged in practice, of course. The actual assessment of the value of the likelihoods and the consequences, appropriate choice of reference points was mentioned, level and sequence of risk aggregation. For enterprise level risk, when you have a kind of a diversity of risk types, risk situations, technologies, hydro versus electric power generation using nuclear or other operational aspects of the utility company, you see that kind of a very, very different risk of different nature and diverse. It's an open system and geographically distributed open system and organizationally distributed, and a very different types of businesses that you run. And so the way you aggregate and sequence the aggregation and the level of aggregation has impact on how actually the ultimate risk scores are calculated, and implications in basically assessing the cost benefit effectiveness of risk mitigation. So appropriate accounting for risk mitigation, where it's applied, is it applied to reducing the likelihood versus the consequences, and at what level? These are technical, more detailed technical challenges. Some of us, I'm sure, have faced in actually applying the technique. Treatment of dependencies, again, Max has already highlighted those in his white paper, level 4. And but those are very critical, very important. If we miss them, I think there's going to be a misrepresentation of the actual risk and the contribution of different risk drivers on the ultimate risk measures. And last but not least, the characterization of quantification of uncertainty, not just because everything is uncertain, but the type of uncertainty and the implications of the types of uncertainty on decision making. I have a couple of slides on that later. So MAVF is mainly a way of packaging results of risk assessment, and it doesn't really prescribe how the risk assessment is done to a large extent. It's in a kind of at the tail end of risk assessment, taking results of applying methods and tools and techniques to get the metric and how you actually combine when you have a multiple risk dimensions. As a result, the possibility exists that if we just focus on how the risk results are packaged for decision making, that there may be a disconnect between that and the way that the risks are calculated, maybe potentially inconsistent, incompatible methods. I've seen that in practice, and some of us have also seen that those that basically are listed as practical challenges. But I think I just want to mention the fact that while we are spending time in understanding basically the most appropriate framework for representing and making decisions using risk, but also I think there needs to be an equal weight given to the methods and tools of assessment. I understand from previous conversations there are other proceedings about basically the need for harmonization of risk methods, additional guidelines, and then maybe more specific ideas about how to advance the tools and techniques. But these two both topics are very important in really appropriate risk-informed decision making, appropriate methods for assessment, appropriate methods for evaluation. Accordingly, since MAVF is more like a packaging of risk result, it doesn't address the other two challenges that I mentioned. So this is well known and established. Next, kind of a similar slide for CBF. Again, it's primarily an attempt to address the first challenge, namely a multi-attribute risk. And conceptual strength and shortcomings have been discussed. The fact that it is straightforward, again, Max Henrigan's paper is very good in making a comparison. CBF is a straightforward interpretation, procedural simplicity compared to MAVF, but it also requires difficult social and ethical value judgment, similar to MAVF, implicit or explicit. It makes it explicit. So it kind of basically doesn't really fundamentally solve the issue, or one of the key issues. Some of the issues regarding the implementation would basically carry on to CBF. We need to address dependencies, uncertainty, level of aggregation, sequence of aggregation, etc. So this also doesn't address the second and the third challenges, namely that have to do with basically risk acceptance criteria, and as well as, of course, dealing with the risk calculation of rare events. Okay. Before I go to the next slide, maybe we go to the next slide and we pause if there is any comment or reaction to this, then I move to the next. If you move to the next slide, which is kind of a start of some suggestions on enhancements. Again, I have stated a lot of the obvious that is commonly known, but it's maybe a reasonable foundation for being able to communicate the rest. If there are no comments or questions, so let me then move ahead with some suggestions. One is really something that I've seen in a number of industries to try to tackle the issue by not focusing on the kind of a bottom line metrics of risk in terms of safety, lives, and dollar, but focusing on what I call surrogate or subsidiary measures of risk. So the idea is kind of is to measure controllable outcomes such as, say, ignition in wildfire, wire down, rather than injuries and fatalities. And other industries that have included this as part of the package of regulatory and oversight functions include the Nuclear Regulatory Commission using core damage frequency as the primary metric for their regulation. For routine regulatory activity, monitoring the industry, communicating matters of safety with them. And two of the present utilities, of course, have and then continue to have experience with how the Nuclear Regulatory Commission works and the nuclear industry works with the concept of core damage frequency as a primary metric of risk and safety. In the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission guidelines and guidebooks, you can see that dam failure probability is the primary metric, although they go further and then also assess the risk curves for lives lost in case of an event. But the dam failure probability is the central metric of another idea that I think is core to another regulatory agency, is oversight and regulatory, Federal Aviation, the FAA, is the use of reliability of critical systems. There's not kind of 9 or 8 critical systems for any aircraft. And they asked the industry, this is for design certification, they asked the industry to essentially demonstrate that the reliability of those critical systems are 10 to the minus 9 or better, right? So, okay, of course, the failure of these systems could result in, because they're critical systems, could cause crash, and a crash could typically causes loss of life. But a lot of the regulatory and oversight activities of the FAA uses the surrogate measure of the critical system reliability. So these are used in in a few domains, and the idea is to define pick what we call the surrogates in a way that they do not require difficult value judgment, right, or ethical judgment. And they also are indicators, good indicators of the actual risk metric. In other words, they're not detached, they're part of really kind of a strong indication of risk to the system or to operation. So appropriately picked at the right level to provide a good early warning or ways of really understanding how much of a safety margin has been used. And they are typically based on what is known as precursors to actual events, such as ignition, for instance, wildfire. So the idea of near miss and precursors as part of a regulatory framework and oversight framework has been adopted by a number of industries, NRC, NASA, FAA, and more recently, BSEE. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, please.
So, yes, so I very much like this idea. We've worked with PG&E gas, and of course, they're worried about a rupture and explosion where people get killed. But I've thought that a surrogate there would simply be loss of containment, a leak. But you didn't mention it, but it's obviously true. You have a much bigger statistical database of these close calls than you have of the actual disasters, which means your statistics are more robust to begin with.
Right, right. A very good point. In fact, if we go to the next slide, please. I want to demonstrate this in a bit more, maybe visually. Next. The slide is not moving at least on my screen.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay. So here, to the point just made, is 15, 16 years ago, FAA posed this question to me. They said, look, we want to see, they mentioned United and American Airlines. Said, look, two airlines, they haven't had crashes for 5 years. And how do we monitor their safety, basically? How do we, see whether they're really achieving our safety goals and safety assessments? And they were looking at a number of other things, such as, okay, these precursors. And said, well, United Airlines had 5, and I'm not, this is not an actual number, this is just remembering, just to make the point. United had 5 engine failures, and American Airlines had 2 hydraulic failures. All right, what does this tell us about, the safety? Of course, both of these are frequent events compared to crashes, so this is a safety indicator and a kind of a very good way of looking at monitoring the level of safety. And then we said, look, and how do we go from this to see kind of a higher level whether these really meet our safety goal? And of course, the idea was really use your models. Models to say, if you look at this little yellow box on the right, it said the actual risk in terms of metrics of interest, such as loss of lives, would be the product of the frequency of these precursors, like engine failure, times the probability of an accident killing people, given the precursor. So if FAA monitors phi, the frequency, they have a pretty good indication, early indicators of the health of the system, away from some of the things that could be quite rare, zero fires, 0 crashes, but you still can have a way of that. And as you said, there's a lot more statistics on that. So there will be more robust basis, and also they have closer ties, more tightly connected to controllable things, where you say, okay, well, I have more ignitions here because, or I have more system failures here, or aviation, I have more engine failures because, and I think kind of you target the reasons for, and then bring it closer to the preventive measures that you typically apply. So that's kind of the idea of a surrogate metric. It's popular in a number of industries that I mentioned. And a few years later, when BSEE was formed as to regulate offshore oil and energy explorations, I was on a committee, and the director came to that committee to get suggestions on basically how to proceed, how to set up the organization in terms of the regulatory framework. Among the things that we basically recommended was, the risk-informed regulatory frameworks that other industries have used, such as nuclear and FERC and all that, but also the importance of the value of using surrogate metrics or precursors as a way of more effectively and routinely and with higher levels of confidence monitoring the safety and the efficiency of the risk-informed decision-making by their industry they're regulating. So that's, I think, and next is another visual, next slide is really the same idea that you can see, you can monitor these indicators, and some of them could be hardware failure, but others, the blue one on the left, missed approach in the language of aviation, is a procedural error, a pilot error. So these risk indicators don't need to be necessarily just sort of physical events, but also organizational or process events. And then you can monitor those, and anytime that you want to say, okay, well, how does this translate to the actual risk in terms of dollars lost or lives lost, then I would say we can basically use the models of the type that I mentioned earlier, kind of a causal model that are popular in many industries, to really show the conditional probability of loss of life given X number of ignitions, for instance, in this industry. Okay, so that's how this is done in other industries. Okay, that's one idea. Next one, and I'm going to now move to a different topic, which again, we have discussed earlier today. The idea of using
Dr. Mosley, sorry, this is Russell Archer from Edison. Before you move on, I just had a quick question.
Yes.
You were talking about the FAA, its regulation of the aircraft sector, or the commercial aviation sector, I should say. Would you agree with me that the size of the airplane is very closely correlated with the number of potential fatalities arising from an accident? In other words, a 747 has 400 people on it, and a short hop puddle jumper has 50 people on it. So, assuming that you agree with that, and I think you would, does the FAA regulate those two types of airplanes fundamentally differently from a safety perspective?
Not fundamentally, but let me kind of put a caveat here. There's two categories of aviation systems, aircraft: general aviation and air carrier for commercial, passenger, which tend to fly larger aircraft, right? Big ones. And the general aviation or a smaller one engine single use, although there are two sets of the requirement for design certification are similar, the 9 or 8 critical systems, but they have a different crash frequency line for larger the commercial aviation versus general aviation. I forgot, whether one has a kind of a much smaller set of probabilities associated, 10 to minus 9 or 7 or 8 per miles flown, as opposed to general aviation that has a kind of a higher acceptably higher crash rate.
No, thank you. And let me just be clear. My question was really geared towards commercial aviation. Would you agree that the FAA doesn't fundamentally regulate a 737 differently than it does a 747?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Mosley.
Sure. And I must say that I think my direct interaction with the FAA monitoring them ended when I had finished one of my large projects about a decade ago. But here and there I hear that pretty much the same regulatory framework applies. So back to the idea of risk representations and implications of some of the things we discussed, and then the value of that. And that is really, how do we portray risk? Is it a single value, or is it better to show the package of basically the risk curve, namely the probability versus consequence, irrespective of what the consequence is, life or dollars or any metric that you use? I'm talking purely about what has become more widely accepted in other industries, that it's best to show the frequency of exceeding different levels of consequences, so that primarily be able to distinguish between different types of risk, even though their averages may be the same. So this is easy. It's in this curve that I'm showing kind of a very old graph, which is at the inception of this idea by Farmer in 1967 or so, dealing with nuclear, comparing the nuclear accidents against other technologies, which was one of his points, and the regulation in the UK and later carried on to the US, is that if I have this lower curve that you see at the bottom on the bottom left, you can see that it's for nuclear calculations, frequency, in this case, number of fatalities was used, but later, as I mentioned, core melt frequency is the primary metric, and the frequency of exceeding such the number of fatalities. That curve, it's easy to see now the difference between low probability and high consequence and high probability, low consequence events. and then see where your equal, risk line lies in terms of a kind of basically a two-dimensional graph. So next slide takes us to what we were discussing before, risk acceptance. So that's a line or a similar idea. And of course, a risk-informed decision making without that line, and I qualify what I mean by line in a minute, is just basic. It's not a risk-informed decision framework. It is, the black lines here, the dark lines are defined or calculated by data or a model. The red line is a societal, political, ethical line. Question.
Yeah, I do have a question here, and a comment. So I thought it was a fascinating comment from about we don't regulate a 747 differently than a 737, even though it has like a quarter of the people. And that's a fascinating question. But of course, when we look at these graphs, I noticed that this is logarithmic.
Right.
And the log of 400 people versus the log of 300 of 50 people is not all that different, right? So I think maybe that's the first thing. And then the other thing is this graph, and this reminds me very much of ALARP.
Right.
What I like about this is it's quick to compare things. It's, again, the risk of being hit by a meteorite in my backyard. If I plotted it on this, I would say I've got more important things to worry about. And I think maybe that is part of the entire thing here is we have to rationally get our heads around some very irrational issues by saying, well, listen, that's like an asteroid strike. Let's not discuss it today, right?
Yeah. In fact, that was very much part of the initial point that Farmer made long time ago, and ever since has been debated for kind of, this is now 50 some years. And but bottom line is that although there have been criticism laid against kind of basically the idea of comparing risks in all these lines, but in practice, a lot of important decisions are made at the policy level based on this type of comparative risk. You mentioned the log scale, also that has been discussed. And if you look at FERC, Bureau of Reclamation, NRC, everybody, they have also debated whether a logarithmic scale is informative or is misleading. These are some of the things that need to be discussed in this community also. Once you say, okay, well, maybe some of these things, as you have already mentioned, some other people have already mentioned, that this would be something that we want to really consider. And some of the same issues could be debated, or lessons learned from other industries can be, maybe applied, and we come up with a resolution fairly quickly. Before going further, I wanted to mention that about 10 years ago, NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, said, I understand the line, I understand those, the black and the green, red line, but this is not how we're going to regulate. We're going to have a band around the red line and a band around the other one, right? And so there's kind of two fuzzy lines that form the basis of regulation and negotiation between the industry and the regulator. And this came up earlier by a comment when the same idea was presented by Vince, that, well, you really can't have sharp lines like this. And nobody actually, in effect, regulates on a sharp, basic crisp lines. There is a margin, there is understanding, there is uncertainty in the actual risk calculations, and there is room for negotiation, societal and political, kind of on an ethical basis, that the red line is not really a red line, is a red band. So that's also something. So NRC said, okay, well, we would regulate based on bands or fuzzy lines, but also risk is not the only consideration. It's not, what we do is not risk-based, it's risk-informed. Meaning, in a very engineering and practical way, is that, look, we regulate core melt frequency and all that, and that gives us, we have the red line and the black line and all that. That's good. We understand that. But we also have the what's known as defense in depth. Again, some of you, I'm sure they have worked in the nuclear, or we've been seeing the nuclear industry's perspective, that the defense in depth, meaning basically doesn't matter how low or high your core melt frequency is. I want the containment of a 3-foot, thick dome of concrete that gives me a separation, a barrier if the core melts. That defense in depth, I'm not going to remove with any probabilistic argument. That's a red line. We need those containments and similar things. That's not the only defense in depth idea that they have, but there's several. So again, that's the risk informed regulation, of course, means having calculations of risk and the lines and other considerations that may become part of the principle by which we regulate the industry. Now, of course, in the power distribution, industry, there are not that many things that you can introduce in terms of redundancy and defensive, barriers and all that. But that's a kind of a technical discussion to see what's possible, what's feasible. Next slide carries this point a bit.
Excuse me, Dr. Mosley, before we go to the multi-attribute risk curve formulation, let's just check for a second if there are others in the audience that have questions.
Thank you.
This is Max Henry here. I do have I guess, an observation, which is, I think on the surrogate measures, like using near misses rather than actual accidents because they're more frequent, I think the utilities already use a similar kind of approach extensively, and I'm sure utilities can comment on that. For example, using frequency of gas leaks rather than ignitions and explosions, kind of as a surrogate for estimating the dangers of explosions, and similarly on for wildfires. Is that accurate? I mean, in other words, they're already using the kind of approach of using surrogates that you suggest, Ali.
Yeah, I'll let our utility participants mention. I know a partial answer to the question.
Max, I don't remember that, frankly. I remember that we were looking at the likelihood of pipes exploding, and I remember mentioning that perhaps we should use loss of containment as a surrogate. So,
well, I think they already do that in many cases.
Yeah. Well,
but it's not up. I'm sure
we should anyway.
Chris and others could comment on that. Anyway, but I guess the other point I'd make is, it's interesting that you point out that, FAA and NRC tends to focus on outcomes like dam failures and, well, I guess not FAA, but other organizations, rather than trying to estimate the number of fatalities and judging trade-offs between fatalities and costs and so on, kind of as kind of a way to sidestep those complex ethical judgments. And whereas in fact, CPUC and the California utilities have been quite a bit more courageous in line with U.S. Department of Transportation. I don't know, maybe not FAA, but and U.S. EPA, where they have been willing to look at trade-offs between, fatalities and costs and reliability explicitly. And so, I mean, I think you're pointing out some organizations have been able to sidestep those issues, whereas other federal government agencies already address them explicitly, as have the audience here.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you, Max, and the comments and observations. There's basically there have been practical reasons and organizational reasons. If you may recall that even FAA at the different level, there is a value of life as is associated with kind of from an insurance point of view, and there's an international agreement in terms of the compensation. But if you continue with that in your routine daily monitoring of how the industry is operating, the levels of safety and all that, and then when you're talking about risk of very, very rare events where the probabilities and numbers that support the calculation of risk are very small or difficult to estimate, the practical value of these surrogate measures become evident and obvious, and that's why they have embraced the idea while they still have in the kind of in some statements about basically the risk criteria and in some of their basically regulatory framework guidance and all that, they have the ultimate risk to the public or to the environment, but those are in the background, and the focus is on of these more tangible metrics or easier to quantify or frequent. In terms of tolerance level, if I can kind of
Dr.
yes.
Mosley, I'm sorry, I wanted to also make an observation on that topic of surrogate metrics. I didn't know if you were moving on. Am I interrupting you?
Please.
Okay. So I'm Chris Parker with Cal Advocates, and if we were to go back briefly to slide 13, where you talked about the surrogate risk metrics, and I just wanted to it does make sense to me what you're discussing about, and I don't know whether surrogate in my mind might insinuate a replacement, but I think you also talked about in the slide prior to this one, enhancements so that the ultimate measure may be injuries or what have you, outcome measurements. But then I think in the follow-up slide to this, you give examples in slide 14, I think, in the civil aviation, if we go to that one, where you talk about looking at indicators. And then in track 2 of this phase 1 of this rulemaking, the commission has adopted a number of enhanced safety metrics, some of them called leading indicators.
Yeah.
And I think that there is a lot of value in that between the operator and the regulator, because then, the safety policy division looks at these risk assessment applications. And then if utilities are using those sorts of metrics to kind of explain the value of the proposed mitigations, the risk reduction, I think there's a lot of value in having that indication, to supplement the outcome metrics, which might boil down to injuries or fatalities. But I think that there is a lot of value in having these enhanced metrics to explain and the mitigations that an operator is coming up with in its risk assessment mitigation phase applications. So it does make a lot of sense to me.
Appreciate the feedback and comment. Yeah. Okay.
Professor Mosley.
Yes.
Yeah, this is Joseph Mitchell, MGRA.
Yes, sir.
I think it's important to point out that to a large extent, your recommendations are already in practice, especially with regard to wildfire, where ignitions or outages are now used to estimate risk. That's how it's being done. And wildfire is the gorilla in the room for the electrical utilities, even for, even as integrated companies. If you look at risk estimates as, the risk from wildfire compared to all the other risks combined, all the utilities agree it's much, much larger. So, and they're using the surrogates, but there's a problem. And the key challenges that drive the wildfire problem are that there are rare external drivers that couple to both likelihood and consequence and make make an inordinate contribution to the overall risk. Let me just give you a quick example because I just prepared this for another proceeding. PG&E recently released a report describing 21 fires, major fires, that occurred over a period of 5 years. What is the probability that 14 of those 21 fires occurred during a period of 2 days? That's, 0, basically. So overlaid on, you're basically puts on risk of, these risk events randomly occurring, which you can predict with precursors. You have on top of that, this overlay of these rare risk drivers that drive the overall answer. And this has been a challenge for all of the utility risk models. And this is something we're working very hard on and we'd really like your input on.
Yeah, extremely good point. None of the organizations are mentioned, and in the context of even wildfire, I think the same point applies. Really, solely focus on these indicators or precursors or surrogates as the only metric of risk. And then they see these things in the context of a model that shows the combination of events or the conditional probability of adverse events given those conditions. So there is always this, I think, more comprehensive picture of the risk situation that is essentially part of the kind of the way that the risks are assessed and portrayed. Except that kind of basically the focal point moves from basically the end consequences of the extreme consequences to somewhere in the middle, and as it's used as an aid for everything else that we have said so far. And I know that I've heard and I've known and from conversations with some utilities that say ignitions is part of their daily debate and discussions and considerations, that kind of in practice it's been used, but it's by no means is a total replacement for the more comprehensive view of the risk and the challenges of that. I'm not suggesting actually that this becomes the kind of the sole way of looking at the risk in its totality. But it is, these surrogate measures provide a pretty good indicator of a lot of things. And this wildfire is a kind of a particular challenge, but the entire regulatory basis is based on many other kind of events and risk drivers. So the idea is really, to the extent that is beneficial, we can actually kind of look at this idea of surrogates and make them a bit more formal, a structured part of our deliberations.
So, Dr. Mosley, I have a question for you related to this. Understanding the, focusing on the precursors, that also means you have to understand the conditional probability between the precursor and the factor you're really interested in, such as fatalities. And it feels to me as though there's a risk that conditional probability is tends to be treated as a constant, and that the interdependencies that could drive your actions on the precursors that would also affect the conditional probabilities get ignored. Is this something that has been addressed or and solved for?
Okay. Yeah, I would say a very good point. That has kind of that goes the heart of basically how you relate these precursors to kind of your risk model and the risk model to the risk metrics. I would say the landscape is mixed. Some organizations are very sophisticated and good at capturing the very kind of a challenge or issue that you highlighted. NRC, I would say that is there. They're probably leading. A few other organizations are working kind of very aggressively toward kind of having the same level of sophistication. I would say Bessie, because I see that they're really pretty much following what NRC has done, so they're catching up pretty fast in terms of using the same techniques so that they can have a kind of a much better understanding of the, as you said, the dependency between the precursor and what happens after that, and the spectrum of things that would be conditioned to the same precursor. So the idea of risk scenario, looking at every case as on its own merit, every scenario, really keeps track of the events that lead to the precursor, lead up to the precursor, and then the events past the precursor. There is a price you pay anyway, and I think your key point is that you lose some of the resolution and some aspects of the dependency that, because you're basically using a pinch point in your model. You say, well, everything that goes like a bow tie, that goes to this point, the past doesn't matter. So you're really compressing everything so that you get the statistics into an event called a precursor. But you can have kind of a variety of precursors, and it can be a bit more sophisticated in terms of basically how you classify the same type of precursor based on the interdependent consequence, or the other conditional probability. That depends on, again, the model, and again that's why I think the model in the background of all these is extremely critical, so that you don't lose sight of some of those subtle issues that you just highlighted. One of them. Right?
Yeah. So clearly, it sounds like the best practices, like the NRC, are capturing those dependencies as data, so that they can make sure that the relationships in the bow tie are valid.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
But Professor, don't you need to have a model of the driver event as well? Because otherwise historical data won't necessarily help you. Example, Fukushima Daiichi power plant. In absence of seismic modeling on that, if you were just looking at its performance data without thinking about the probability of a seismic events large enough to create a tsunami capable of taking out the pumps, or I'm sorry, the generators, that wouldn't help you. So don't you really need to look at the fundamental driving mechanisms and then use that as the input to your probability calculation or your risk calculations?
I totally agree. You're absolutely right. That's why I mentioned, I said it in different ways, maybe not clear enough, and I apologize. But really, I think having a model, a causal model of the risk situation is essential if we really want to have a credible, reliable reference point for our, understanding the risk. Yeah, that's that. And then precursor and other things could be identified and understood and properly calculated and utilized only in the context of having this kind of a underlying model. And so all the industries that I mentioned already do have those underlying models, and the precursors are defined to a large degree based on basically this context model. One industry rushed. That's after the Gulf. The British BP Gulf leakage, basically pipe failure, or what's the right word? The accident happened about 8-9 years ago. They rushed to kind of basically define precursors that the industry would monitor, so that basically you have early warning, early indicators. But they ended up with 5,000 indicators or precursors and all that, because they didn't have an underlying model of the process, underlying model of the risk. And you can make this thing a lot more effective, informed, and efficient if you have the underlying model based on which you can define the precursors and collect the appropriate statistics. FAA did the opposite, NRC did the opposite. They had the models and then defined the precursors based on that. Bessie not Bessie, the industry ahead of Bessie was rushing to get the indicator program running. And they went to Department of Transportation for early indicators of transportation accidents, and they ended up with a huge statistical pile of things that, Excel files. They couldn't really use it for basically communicating risk issues. So it's not effective if you really don't have that background model. Just to your point, yeah.
Thank you.
I Googled it. That was the Deepwater Horizon.
I'm sorry.
I asked Professor Google.
Yes, yeah. I spent 4 years on that committee. I should remember the event, but yeah.
Dr. Mosley, let's see if we can move on to our subsequent slide, please.
Right. Okay, good. All right. So this is a variation of the same thing, namely basically applying these the risk curve to multiple attributes. Here, we're basically not addressing still the core issue. If you want to combine them together, what do you do? Which, basically gave rise to the need for something like, normalized utility functions. But, in a recent work that we have done for PG&E, it's kind of basically a research. It's nothing that they've adopted or approved or anything. It's just a research program. That we say, look, let's look at all these different dimensions with the corresponding risk curve, circuit by circuit, line by line, and then aggregate them. But of course, all these things can be summarized and reduced into kind of a single metrics. I have something that I thought about kind of last night. I think maybe it's crazy or not, unconventional, or maybe trivial and obvious and not very useful, and that is of the 3-4 kind of attributes that we have, some of them are easier to translate into dollars with no emotional kind of aspect to it. Safety and loss of lives is. So I'm thinking that maybe there is a way of keeping these two separately, combine the ones that can translate into dollars easily, and then safety separate. And think about kind of basically a risk metric is more like a risk vector. And come up with the mathematical ways of showing the effectiveness of mitigation and spending in a vector kind of a space, as opposed to a a condensation of these metrics into a point in space. I haven't formulated anything, and maybe something that is just not worth pursuing, but there may be ways of avoiding the kind of this difficult ethical and value judgment on human life. But anyway, so let's.
Well, I just want to make a comment on this because I've been thinking about the same thing. And it's what Joe Mitchell brought this up earlier about being able to see trade-offs.
Yes.
So I'm not going to call it a vector space, although I know what you mean. It's a two-dimensional space or three-dimensional space in which the stakeholders can view trade-offs.
Right. Exactly.
And two stakeholders, one who cares more about safety and one who cares more about reliability, can duke it out the old-fashioned way. But I want them to duke it out on a Pareto optimal frontier.
When they see exactly where things are, the points are, right? Yeah.
I don't want them off mud wrestling where they're both wrong, right?
Right. Very good point. Yeah. Well, it's something that we can probably take offline and discuss. It's just, some, many years ago, I presented I presented to another agency, NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology. That was in the context of cybersecurity. So I took, the same idea, just said, basically, let's have a three-dimensional, I showed it in three-dimensional. I'll find that slide and then send it to you. It's kind of, I think you're talking about that type of idea. And is really to see exactly where the points are with respect to the different dimensions. And the debates actually become a little bit easier, to see basically the relative position of the points and then how the points actually move in this three-dimensional space based on, dollar expenditure, effort, or other considerations. Okay. Maybe if I can move to the next slide and please. All right. So this was kind of basically Army Corps of Engineers, idea of the cliff, right? Basically, look, this is the risk curve and frequency versus consequences, the acceptance line. At certain point, we are not going to accept anything that would give us, 1,000 fatality or more as a result of dam failure. This is where they use N, the FN curve, or the frequency versus number of fatalities. So this is also, and again, the line is not going to probably be a kind of a solid line. It's more like a fuzzy or band. But again, what I'm saying is that other sectors have spent a lot of time debating, discussing these things, and then maybe there is value in this community to kind of spend a little bit of time looking at what others have done and ideas, the ones that apply, and then translate. I think it would be good, more effective way of achieving a convergence and consensus. Next. All right, so I make a couple of points about uncertainty. I mean, the notion of uncertainty is understood. People know, we all know that, for a kind of an actual portrayal of actual risk, we really must address the question of uncertainty. But I wanted to mention a couple of things about the nature of uncertainty that has implications on actual risk-informed decision making. So if I look at types of uncertainty, and this is not kind of this is kind of a generally accepted kind of not generally accepted kind of people are familiar with what I'm talking about here in terms of the terminology and then the classes, but maybe not universally totally accepted the same way. But anyway, if you look at uncertainty in any model or assessment, you're talking about parametric uncertainty in the data and other values in our models, and also uncertainty about the model itself. How credible is a model? Is a good model, not so good, and we know that models are subject to kind of produce things that don't necessarily reflect total reality by definition. But in terms of, so both of these parametric and model uncertainties are important. One is very difficult to capture and quantify, although there's a lot of work that has been done in that area of capturing model uncertainty, but the parameter uncertainty is better understood. But in the parameter uncertainty, again, This is something that people like Max, who have been really kind of a domain expert in this area for decades, understand and appreciate, is the epistemic uncertainty and aleatory. And again, not a fundamental distinction, but a practical distinction is useful. Epistemic is kind of how much information do we have or we need to know the actual value of a parameter that ultimately has a single value. Aleatory uncertainty is a kind of the uncertainty that is really comes from nature, and it's or in a randomness of events that we cannot control. It's not a matter of learning more. It's more like really, randomness in nature. So capturing both of these with an uncertainty is important because the implications of how much of these uncertainties can you reduce to make your risk calculations better, more precise, easier to make decision on. We need to recognize that some of these are aleatory uncertainties and are really controlled by God, by nature, by other forces. And then when we characterize uncertainty, quantify uncertainty, we need to kind of have these, to the extent possible, kept separately and tackled separately. And then, of course, in complex models, if you're using those, the assessment of uncertainty, which is in itself, an important step, and the propagation of these uncertainties properly through our models. Max has already mentioned in his white paper, the issue of correlation among the different attributes. When you do uncertainty sampling, it's important to know that they're correlated or correlated mitigation capabilities, correlated input parameters, correlated data. There's a lot of interdependencies that have implications of how we do uncertainty propagation. This is a point more like, other than the first point about, basically making a distinction between aleatory and epistemic from a decision, risk-informed decision-making perspective. The rest of this has to do with really advancing the state of the art in this discipline, in this domain, community, with respect to really doing credible risk assessment as input to decision making. Once we have, portrayed and characterized the uncertainties, next slide, please. You can basically show that in your risk curve or other measures. And the point that this is made in terms of implications of separating aleatory versus epistemic uncertainties really has an impact on how you see these curves, basically. How much of that will be a matter of spending money and effort and to learn more and do more experiment or gather more data, and how much it is really we have to accept that's kind of basically forced by nature. Let me pause if there is any point or a comment. Otherwise, we can move to kind of last few. I hope I can wrap up quickly. I have a few additional considerations. Basically, the notion of really compatibility of risk metric for risk-informed decision-making and the models that produce those risk metrics. I've already highlighted a few points, and I think the point is really whenever we talk about risk-informed decision-making and how we actually measure and make decisions, I think it's important to also know that we have a good understanding of how these risk numbers are generated, because particularly in the utility environment, company environment, there's such a diversity of risk contributors, risk metrics, lines of business, that we want to make sure that there is a compatibility as consistency of the methods and tools used to calculate those risks with the way we basically understand and then package those for decision making. So there is some important kind of considerations in terms of the fact that decision making with risk metrics and the methods of calculating those are tightly coupled in terms of basically making risk decisions. Next. All right. Well, this is something to show that one of the values of having an underlying understanding and a model, again, this is an FAA example, is that FAA uses the model as a way of communicating with the industry. Therefore, basically these models, whether it's kind of as a basis for their surrogate measures or the actual total risk and all that, provides a language of communication between the two. So they don't regulate only based on, the bottom line numbers. They also look at, basically whether the industry has applied credible, acceptable methods. And this thing in a much more rigorous way is applied by NRC. In fact, when I go to the next slide, maybe wrapping up or that, I want to come back to this point. Maybe next slide. So other things that kind of one can or learn from other industries, this harmonization between kind of the tools and methods used by different stakeholders, and by robust and consistent application of the methods for regulatory applications. And I know that this has been discussed because I listened to a video of one of your meetings, is that where there was a discussion about basically agreeing on some basic principles, core framework, minimum requirement of a credible risk assessment and risk management as part of this package. We can't just focus on how we combine different risk metrics. We really have to spend an adequate amount of time in making sure that the foundations and the principles are agreed upon, and then there is kind of a reasonable level of agreement in terms of what tools and techniques are acceptable or credible. So other industries rely on guidebooks, good practices, guidelines. NRC, NASA, FAA, FERC, etc. all have these. And some have even gone beyond that and then introduced the standards for nuclear industry, for instance. ASME and ANS, American Nuclear Society, a standard for doing PRA, risk assessment. And all of them heavily rely on peer review. That peer review meaning basically industry partners, IOU to IOU, and also experts outside the community, experts hired by the regulator, because after all, this is a kind of a business of a lot of science, but a lot of art also, a lot of judgment, a lot of good judgments, technical judgments. And finally, next slide. I believe it's the last one, is in summary. My point is, again, is that I think others have mentioned this, that both MMVF and CBE frameworks need improvements to be responsive to all the challenges of risk-informed decision-making, not just the kind of the question of monetization or metrics of basically utility representation. And essentially moving from MAVF to CBE trades inherently difficult value judgments. And so that doesn't really fully make life easy in terms of the actual bottom line metrics. So the idea of surrogate metrics may help in as part of the package. And also, as I just said, there's a vast body of knowledge and experience in other sectors that offer pathway for enhancements in defining risk metrics, in establishing risk tolerance, and applying compatible risk assessments, developing and applying compatible risk assessment. With that, let me stop and then see if there are any comments and discussions that we need to have. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah. So much wonderful stuff here. A great presentation. I want to back up quickly though to your, what you call it, aleatory versus epistemic.
Yes.
Okay. Well, there's an obvious application. Which is which? Epistemic is like we don't really understand what's going on here.
Right, that's right. It's a Greek word, right?
Got it. And the
Yeah,
aeroplane,
aleatory is Latin kind of related to reality. It's a reality.
the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. We're never going to beat that, right?
Right, right.
So let me tell you where the first one is incredibly important, and that we don't quite know how to model it yet. In the gas transmission area, a lot of the mitigations are tests, like hydro tests to see if the pipe is going to rupture, or they call them ILIs, inline inspections, right? So we need to properly gauge if we're going to measure the RSE or the monetization of doing a test. We have to measure the value of that information in a decision theoretic sense. Was the information we got by doing $1 million inline inspection worth it or not? And that is exactly what you're calling the epistemic uncertainty. So we have an application for that right now, I would say.
Yeah. Some argue, and maybe Max will argue, that uncertainty is uncertainty. Fundamentally, everything goes back whether us as human beings fully understand nature or not, and nature is not random, so there is no aleatory uncertainty. But that's kind of a conceptual, theoretical, maybe physics, philosophy, and all that. In practice, we face these two types, and then they have impact on how we make decisions in terms of what to tackle, where to tackle the reduction of uncertainty that has impact on our decisions.
Yeah, Ali, I think I agree with you. I mean, it is a useful distinction. I mean, I tend to use the words which I realize you might find not totally satisfactory, but statistical uncertainty versus subjective or judgmental uncertainty. And if you have enough data, you can figure out what the uncertainty is statistically just from standard statistical methods. That's kind of comfortable and easy, at least for those of us that understand a little bit of statistics. And then there's the expert judgment aspect of it, where you have quantities. For example, you're trying to forecast the change. You have historically the frequency of wildfires and enough data to estimate to some extent the probability of an ignition from a power line wildfire. There's just about enough data to do that historically, but of course things are changing. With climate change, and looking forward into the future, if you're trying to estimate how those things might be changing, how the temperature might be changing, and the humidity, consequent humidity, and the correlation with the wind speed.
That's a good example.
We have models and data to help estimate that, but going forward a few years into the future, there's a fair amount of expert judgment needed. So we need both those things, and I think perhaps already, in terms of the statistical uncertainty, that's already being modeled very well by the utilities. I think the recommendation that may be coming in terms of projecting forward, particularly with uncertainties due to climate change, and that's just one example. There is a certain amount of expert judgment needed there, and but there may be some discussion about the best way to do that. But.
Right, yeah. No, I agree with you. Basically, that's kind of a variation in the terminology, but fundamentally, we're thinking the same thing. One point I was trying to make was that, and it's a challenge, not easy, is that if it's possible through the calculations and models and all that, to try to keep these two uncertainties separate in terms of showing at the kind of the final results and the risk curves and other thing, which is not easy. But because of the kind of the different sources of these uncertainties, then the decisions makers at the kind of utility company or even the public or PUC can decide, this is something that, we can spend another $1 million and reduce this uncertainty because it's just a matter of basically, understanding the physics of the problem or that. The other one is nature. Temperature varies from day to day, and then in the next 50 years, we're going to have a climate change, and it's nature doing its thing, and the best we can do and apply there is some expert judgment and understanding, some additional modeling, but understanding what these sources are would have at least would highlight, you know, things that we need to know about what kind of controls we have, right?
Yeah, I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I would like to ask you about your second point in the summary slide here.
Yes.
So, you know, right now there's this proposal to move from the NAVF framework to a cost-benefit framework. And, you know, of course, you're right that there's value judgments, most notably about value of statistical life, or, you know, trade-off between dollars and fatalities and safety, whichever method you use. You know, I guess the question is, do you see that issue as being significantly different or more complex with one framework versus the other framework, or is it really just an issue with both of them? CBF makes it, obviously, value of statistical life a little more explicit, but implicitly, MAVF has to deal with the same issue.
It basically, what you just said, and basically both of them, you know, one has a bit more explicit way of putting value, the other one is an implicit way. And so if the motivation, I didn't know exactly the motivation that the kind of the debate to move to CBF, which has merits, of course, you know, simplicity, you highlighted those, you know, your paper is really quite good in identifying, you know, the merits of that, is that, yeah, it makes things simpler, but if the primary motivation was to really reduce the burden on part of the assessors and also the public, or, you know, the decision makers and utility, PUC, you know, kind of agreeing or disagreeing with the value judgment, then both of them, you know, pose the same challenge. So, yeah, then maybe what the point practically, kind of in terms of moving forward, is that, like, you know, both of them say same problem, but one is easier to understand, or maybe more transparent, or easier to communicate. You go by other attributes, not that this one will solve the problem that we had before.
Very good, thanks.
I've got one more question about, Ali, you mentioned a few minutes ago, you know, where are we going to spend our millions of dollars of modeling or whatever? Well, I mean, we have to recognize that climate change and many of these things are very nonlinear and subject to you know, chaos theory, and calling chaos theory a theory is being very charitable. But one of the things about chaos is, this is the fact, you know, that tiny changes in the 15th decimal place of your assumptions will make a huge change in the model. But one of the beneficial things I think we can do here is to try to understand the chaotic boundaries. In other words, okay, this is so nonlinear over here that we shouldn't waste our time now trying to figure out really what's going to happen, but put hedges in place to deal with that uncertainty. I mean, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think going back to an aeronautical analogy here, they have flight simulators that are very good for big airplanes. You can get checked out in a big commercial plane in a flight simulator. But the flight simulators, I don't think, are so good once you stall the plane and put it into a spin, because then it's guided by chaos, right? And so I think the rule is don't put the plane into a spin. But we may need to think of the same sorts of things, that we've got models that are good within the chaotic boundaries, and we just have to understand how to search for those boundaries and then be prepared for anything beyond those.
Relax, Sam, a very good point. It reminds me of, so again, nuclear industry, because these have been debated for decades within the industry, that industry, and smart people come up with, clever ideas on how to kind of find a way to something that is rational, reasonable, given the fact that there's a lot of unknowns and uncertainty. One example is once you have a core melt in a reactor, what happens in the containment of a nuclear reactor? There's a lot of unknowns. In fact, how things would evolve and so there a lot of procedures in terms of accident response, which is part of the regulation, and that is really to bracket the case basically, without fully understanding what happens in between. Basically say, okay, well, here's the extreme that is can be physically can physically happen. Volume of explosives and all of that. And then what you want to do is to build the containment such that that extreme case is controlled, right? So now that is part of why they go to this defense in depth and say, like, we don't understand the phenomena. I want the barrier so that I won't harm the public. How does that translate into climate change or routine kind of basically fires, they're going to call it routine, that happen now? Is something that one has to kind of think about and see if there are pathways within this particular domain. But I think the idea of, that we're really managing risk with a lot of uncertainty, some of which is basically knowledge and domain, some of it coming from how nature is going to behave, and we don't fully understand it, is to try our best to bracket the problem and then basically say this is what we regulate on, and of course sometimes we miss. There's no but we can't remove all the uncertainties. A term used by a professor who was an expert in the phenomenology of what happens in the containment of a reactor after a nuclear accident, and he said, don't try to estimate the uncertainty and all that. We are going to manage it by defining the extremes and then basically define what are the best defenses against those. Instead of using the term uncertainty assessment, he used the term uncertainty management, and by which he really meant having an assessment of the uncertainty and then bracketing the problem based on physical arguments and then preparing for those extremes. I don't know. I have nothing to add to this. I don't know if there are any.
Thank you, Dr. Mosley. I think that this concludes SCE's part of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mosley. Thank you, Chris, SCE, and thank you to PG&E as well, Vincent and Ken. I just wanted to let you guys know, just remind everybody that comments are due on the staff proposal ruling on, I believe it's August 29th for opening comments, and then in 5 days thereafter, the reply comments will be due. So hopefully this conversation today helped you think about what you. Oh, Chris, you have a question. Go ahead.
No, it might. In fact, I'm not sure if you were already going to mention this. I was just curious from these two presentations, PG&E and SCE. I know the purpose of this meeting was, as was outlined at the beginning, a platform for PG&E and SCE to present and discuss concerns regarding the staff proposal recommendations And I'm just curious if there were like a quick way to summarize these two presentations, you know, like, I don't know, just to get a takeaway from this meeting, for what I should take away from these presentations. I don't know if there was any quick way to kind of reframe that or restate that.
Chris, this is Chris Vias. Thank you for the question. I'll just try to answer on behalf of SCE. Is that I think one thing that has come about is that there are ways to improve and make both frameworks more useful, whether it's the MAVF or the cost-based one. There is not agreement, like the cost-based one doesn't lead to agreement. For example, something like the value of statistical life, there is disagreement about that. There were things that SCE didn't necessarily agree with in the discussion of VSL that was occurring earlier this afternoon. And so I think if I could summarize at least one part of it is that there is work to be done here, and that the move, as Dr. Mosley showed, moving to a cost-based one may not really address the difficulties that are causing or motivating the desire to shift from MAVF, and that maybe improvement is the way to go, or at least examining further on what would improve. And I think Dr. Mosley gave us some pretty good roadmaps on where improvements can occur and what guidance can be found from other industries that have established productive ways.
Thank you, Chris. Vincent or
Yeah, I'll summarize, you know, once again, want to thank Dr. Mosley for his presentation. And the way we see it with the proposal by the staff, like I mentioned earlier, doesn't preclude us from implementing what we need to in a risk framework, including all the things that Dr. Mosley has pointed out. He's given us very fertile ideas to think about for our 2024 run. And you know, whether it's done in the cost benefit framework, whether it's done in the current MAVF framework, those are things that we want to look at. And going forward, the cost benefit doesn't preclude us from doing that. And I think that the transparency is a good thing, because I think it brings out this issue to the forefront even more, right? Because now you're going to have your risk in dollars. Everybody understands what a dollar is, but you know, I don't think Dr. Mosley, you know, he did a very good job of bringing up all these issues, which, you know, it's like I learned something new today. There's so much to this problem, and you know, the more transparency and more clarity we bring to these policy issues, I think it's going to benefit the whole risk discussion for everyone.
Thank you, Vincent. And you know, another piece of the work that's so important going into phase 3 is really establishing a set of priorities that we can work on together to improve. You know, I don't want to assume what's going to be adopted, what's not going to be adopted in this process, but within the RDF framework, or the risk-based decision-making framework, we will continue to work on areas that would improve upon the decision-making framework. Okay, with that said, I think PG&E said that they would distribute or circulate their presentation by email. Same with SCE. Is that correct, Chris?
Yes.
Okay.
We will be distributing our slides. I put a note in the chat too that
Okay.
we'll be similarly sharing our slides.
Great, thank you. With that, yeah, just remember to submit opening comments by the 29th, and then we'll reply comments shortly thereafter. And then I think that's the end of this meeting. Level 4 and SPD can stay on a little bit longer if people decide they want to ask a few more questions.
Arnold, real quick, in case I probably just missed it. So opening comments on the 29th, and then reply comments.
I believe it's September 6th because Labor Day's on the 5th.
Yeah, that's right, Arnold. That's what my internal calendar says. The 6th for reply comments.
Thank you, Arnold, and thank you to the CPUC team. Much appreciated.
Thank you guys, and thanks to all the presenters today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.